On behalf of the One Health Education Committee, welcome to the webinar today. The One Health Education Committee was established to help improve the quality of life of animals and humans by providing education for animal welfare and human service professionals. My name is Josh Houry, and I'm the Community Relations Coordinator here at the Saskatchewan SPCA. Thank you for joining us for the third presentation in the Violence Link webinar series. These four webinars explore the complex relationship between all forms of violence. This includes the abuse of children and older adults, domestic violence, which we will cover today, and animal abuse. Today's presentation is entitled Domestic Violence, What to Know, Say, and Do. Domestic violence impacts everyone in a family, including their pets. Unfortunately, many people aren't aware of the warning signs of abuse and are in long-term relationships before they realize what is happening. It can be difficult to know how to get out or to ask for help. It is also difficult to know how to support someone who is living with abuse. This presentation will cover warning signs and risk factors, statistics and on prevalence, and why it can be difficult to get out of abusive situations. The link between animal abuse and their pets will also be covered, and how to find resources near you. We are inviting you to share your questions using the Q&A feature. If you hover your mouse near the bottom of your screen, you will see a menu bar pop up. Q&A is one of the options there. Please use that feature to ask any questions that you may have. Joanne has agreed to answer questions as they come in throughout the presentation. And also near the end of the presentation, we will open it up for verbal discussion as well. And if you have a microphone, we invite you to use your raise hand or the raise hand feature at the bottom of the screen. And we can then set it up so that you and Joanne can discuss your question verbally. And now, today's presenter is Joanne Dusel. Joanne is the Executive Director of the Provincial Association of Transition and Houses and Services of Saskatchewan. She is a longtime social justice advocate who spent 2 decades working with women survivors at Moose Jaw Transition House. She is currently co-chair of the Board of Directors of Women's Shelters Canada and is frequently consulted by the media on issues related to violence against women. Joanne?
Thanks so much, Josh, and thanks to all of you for giving up your lunch hour to be here today. I'm just going to share my screen here and get that PowerPoint presentation up, and we'll just launch in. So, as promised, what we're going to talk about is domestic violence, as it's more traditionally known, also known as intimate partner violence, what to know, say, and do. So you might be more familiar with the term domestic violence. At PADS, we like to use the term intimate partner violence for a number of reasons. One of the things that we think about is the fact that domestic violence historically has been something that was considered a private family matter, not very serious, something that people don't talk about. We also want to acknowledge that this form of violence can take place outside of the home. It doesn't have to be between a married couple. It's more something that can happen between any two individuals who are currently or have been in an intimate relationship with one another. So you may hear me say domestic violence or DV interchangeably with IPV. What I mean is intimate partner violence. One of the main things that it's important to know about intimate partner violence is that it's not necessarily characterized by a single incident. It is a pattern of behavior that takes place over time in which one partner in a relationship is working to establish and maintain power and control over the other partner in the relationship. So there's a number of different ways that can happen and different methods that are used by one partner who is seeking to establish and maintain this power and control. So often, again, when you think of domestic violence, the first thing that often springs to people's minds is physical violence. It's someone, they're getting hit, they're getting a black eye, they might, other physical injuries. And that is absolutely part of intimate partner violence. But it's important to know also that intimate partner violence takes place on a spectrum. And it can include everything from name calling, swearing at, put downs, psychological abuse that we're going to delve into just a little bit later, the physical violence that is more easily recognizable, financial and economic abuse of a partner. What is sexual abuse in an intimate relationship? If you're married, can there be sexual abuse? Some people have difficulty understanding that it's actually illegal, and there is in fact sexual assault possible within a marriage and a committed relationship. There's spiritual abuse, excessive jealousy and control, harassment after separation, and all the way to the far end of the spectrum is murder. So intimate partner violence can occur between anyone, any two people who have been or are in an intimate relationship. It doesn't have to be long term. It's not necessarily different for people who are married or unmarried. People of all ages can experience intimate partner violence. It often can begin in teen dating relationships, and older adults are not immune from experiencing intimate partner violence. There is no gender, race, culture, economic, status level, religious or cultural background that is safe from experiencing intimate partner violence. It can happen to anyone. Some groups, including people experiencing disability and individuals who are from marginalized genders and sexual orientation, can experience higher rates. We're going to delve into that a little bit more further on the presentation. So let's look at some of the different types of intimate partner violence that are out there. Again, physical violence is probably the one that's most easily recognizable. I noticed in the chat that there was a number of staff from domestic violence shelters attending the webinar, and they may be familiar, as I was, with receiving phone calls from someone who is absolutely miserable in the relationship, who is being degraded, controlled, and abused in a number of ways, calling in and saying, I'm not sure if what I'm experiencing is domestic violence because I haven't been hit. So what I want you to all know is that it goes far beyond that. And many of the women that I worked with while I was a shelter worker told me that the bruises, the physical injuries, were easier to heal from than the pain from emotional and psychological abuse. Under physical abuse, there's a few things here I'd like to highlight because of the nature of the seriousness that can be connected with experiencing those forms of abuse. Choking or strangulation, as it's more technically called, is one of the more serious forms of physical violence that's actually connected with a higher likelihood of lethality, not only because it can result in death in 4 or 5 minutes. If someone is having both blood and oxygen cut off to their brain, they can actually die in a very short period of time. So it's dangerous for that reason. It's also dangerous because people who are experiencing that form of physical violence may actually have long-term impacts to not only their physical structures in their neck, but they're more susceptible to things like strokes further on. So there's long-term impacts to the victim. There's also research that shows that individuals who use choking or strangulation against their partners are some of the most dangerous offenders out there. They are actually linked to individuals who take part in mass shootings and individuals who will go on to kill police officers. So one thing that we know is someone who is using strangulation or choking with an intimate partner is someone who would be considered to be a very high risk for serious violence. I also want to point out confinement. You might not consider this as physical violence, but in the context of working in a shelter and learning a lot about intimate partner violence over the past 26 years that I've done this work, I've heard many stories of people who, when they were trying to flee a violent crisis, a situation where they were fearing to be physically harmed, they might have actually gone to the bathroom, to the basement, to the bedroom, and ended up being locked there for hours or days. This again is something that is very concerning, and that something that someone who's experienced this violence might not think to tell someone about when they're seeking help, because again, there's not that aspect of physical harm, perhaps, but there's very much a power and control aspect to that action of confinement. Sexual abuse can include anything that is done without free and verbal consent. If someone is either using threats or coercion to get what they want sexually, or if they're have shared intimate images or threatening to share intimate images if the person doesn't do what the abusive partner wants them to do, then that is very much part of the pattern of power and control and abuse. Under emotional and psychological, there's a few things that I want to point out specifically. You can read most of the items on the screen there. Isolation is a very serious part of the pattern of intimate partner violence. And again, this is not something that someone who doesn't have an in-depth knowledge of domestic violence would think of as a serious risk factor. What the purpose of isolation is multiple. One of the purposes is actually to make sure that the victim is not able to speak to anybody about what's going on to them. They're not able to mention anything or reach out and ask for help. They're also, if there have been any physical altercations, there's physical injuries, then no one is going to be able to see them. Also, with isolation, the victim starts to become very dependent on the abusive partner. So it gets to be, over time, a situation where the perpetrator is actually the only person that they get any contact with. They're getting both positive reinforcement, because that does come as part of the cycle of abuse. It's not all bad. Sometimes there's positive reinforcement, but there's also the pain. So the person who's experiencing this abuse relies on their partner for everything. And very often it's not only the emotional support, but it's also food, shelter, and medical care, and all of their needs are being filled by that one person, which again can make it harder to leave in the end. There's often a lot of intimidation that's taking place, and that could be direct threats to the victim, but it can also include threats to others. So threats to family and friends, threats to children, things like, if you leave me, you'll never see the children again. Now, that's not a direct threat of harm, so the police might not see that as a chargeable threat. And yet, for the person who's a victim, what does that mean? That can mean they're going to physically take the children and flee with them. It could mean they're going to falsely accuse them of abuse or neglect, so they would lose custody of the children. It might mean that they were going to take them to court and try and get primary custody of those children. Or, sadly, what actually does happen sometimes, that threat is actually intended to mean, and it does mean that they would actually go to the step of killing the children to get revenge on the other partner. Pets can also be used in a similar fashion. We know how important our pets are. And so threats to harm or kill, or actually harming and killing pets, are a piece of that. Gaslighting is a term that's come to mean over the years, in the context of domestic violence, shifting a person's way of viewing the world so that they begin to distrust their own sense of sanity and their own sense of reality. It is very damaging, and it goes hand in hand with isolation. If you are isolated from friends and family, if you're not allowed to work, then you're being told over and over again, for example, that you're crazy, that you're unstable, that you're losing it, that you need to see a psychiatrist. After a while, it's very common to start being very concerned and perhaps even start to believe some of those things. It can also go beyond being told that you're going crazy. There can actually be acts in place that are really meant to mess with a person's mind. So an example might be a partner who's repeatedly hiding the victim's car keys and then telling them that they're losing it, they're forgetful, there's something wrong with them because they keep losing those keys. This is the term gaslighting actually comes from a play and a movie that first became famous in the 40s. There's been a few different versions of it, and it does an excellent example of showing exactly what gaslighting is and coercive controlling behavior. So if you haven't seen it and you get a chance, I would highly recommend that. Economic abuse is another one that sometimes people don't recognize when they're dealing with it. And the lines are a little bit blurry there, because certainly there are relationships in which one partner is just better at handling the finances. If we go back to older generations, it was probably more common for the male partner to be the one who controls bank accounts, to make major decisions, around purchases, to hold the credit cards, etc. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but when one partner is preventing the other person either from working, from knowing about the finances, doing things like interfering with their employment, sometimes it means racking up debt in the other partner's name, putting bills in the other partner's name and not paying them, those have long-term consequences for the victim, even if they're able to get out of that relationship. Spiritual abuse includes using beliefs to manipulate or control. So sometimes that's things like using scriptures to justify abuse. But spiritual abuse can also be mocking someone's spiritual beliefs or preventing them from practicing their spiritual beliefs, all of which are harmful. And if you're preventing someone from practicing their spiritual beliefs, sometimes that actually is also feeding into the isolation, so that again, if someone, they oftentimes with isolation, what happens is the abusive partner begins to break off connections with family members. They don't like me. They're no good for you. With friends, well, I'm insecure. I get jealous if you go out with your friends, so I really don't like it. And then over time, that person begins to become more and more isolated. And oftentimes one of the last things might be going to church if it's, Christian, it's Sunday, it would be a normal routine. If a partner starts to interfere with that, again, they are not only establishing the fact that they can control your behavior, but they're also eliminating another source of support and further isolating the victim. Stalking is any persistent, unwanted following, watching. It can be coming by the workplace. It can be driving around your house frequently. It can be checking up with you, whether it's like multiple texts, phone calls, emails, always wanting to know where you are. We often think about stalking as something that happens after the relationship has ended, but when you have these very intense patterns of power and control, it does also often happen that the partner is keeping an eagle eye. The abusive partner is watching the victim partner even while their couple is still together. So this is someone who drives their partner to work every morning, picks them up exactly at 5 o'clock or whatever time they get off, takes them to hair appointments, always is there. And, that could be misconstrued by observers who may think that that's actually, really nice and good. Unfortunately, now with technology, it's become far easier to monitor, to stalk, to use apps, to use tracking devices. Hidden cameras, smart homes have all been used to stalk and monitor victims. Sometimes being nice is part of the pattern of abuse. It might seem weird to see that in this list. There's two ways that this happens, and one is actually being nice to everyone else. So neighbors, friends, family may think, oh, that Mary, she's the nicest person, out there. I can't believe she would be abusive. Look, she's head of the PTA and she delivers lunches for seniors. She can't possibly be this, abusive person that you're talking about. And that also makes it more difficult for victims to leave and be believed. So part of the reason that this happens is we have been conditioned through fairy tales and romance novels and romantic comedies to think that over-the-top romantic gestures, persistent following and trying to get someone to be with you is romantic. And what it actually is a very concerning red flag. Very often, when we learn about the history of very serious cases of domestic violence, including those that end in homicide, the relationship is characterized by getting involved very, very quickly. So moving very quickly from dating to living together to marriage. Very often what happens is the person who is setting it up for abuse is so attentive, so loving. There's flowers and there's gifts and there might be trips. There is a need to be with you all the time. I want to, like the abusive partner may be saying things like, I don't know how I lived without you. I need to be with you all of the time. And just really press for this really early involvement. And that's shortly thereafter the isolation begins. So that is something to be very aware of. Many of the things that we're taught to think of as romantic are actually red flags. So this is the cycle of abuse, which many of you may have seen. Now, this cycle of abuse starts, as they often do, with tension building, where things start off wonderful, that romance period that I just described. Then, once the person who's wanting to establish power and control feels like they're getting there, they've hooked the victim, they start to get testy, they start to get critical. The victim starts to be like, wonder what the heck is going on, and take steps to try and prevent conflict. This can go on and on for quite a while, and it's very, very difficult for the victim. This is the stage where they feel like they're walking on eggshells. They don't know what they can do to change things, and they're doing everything they can to prevent a violent incident from occurring. Josh.
Joanne, we have a question that's come through, and the question is there more recognition of parental alienation as a form of IPV?
I certainly recognize that it is. And in fact, I could give a 5-hour presentation probably just on that. Parental alienation is very complex. It's often used in the context of bitter custody disputes. And it's difficult because often what happens is cross allegations, and there are too few experts willing to speak up in court or to be accepted in court, or judges who will accept the word of experts on that. But to answer it is, like, I guess I haven't been brief, but yes, it's a serious concern, and it's something that we're aware of. And it may be interesting to note that we actually have been doing training with family law professionals, and that's something that we talk about in depth. So thanks for that question. Thank you. Tension building will build and build, and it will get very difficult for the survivor, and eventually at some point there will be an incident. Once that could be verbal, emotional, it could be physical violence. Basically, it's a big blow up, and then the tension is released. Often we cycle around now to reconciliation. The abusive partner apologizes. They may give excuses. They may say it was the victim's fault. They may minimize, deny that the abuse was as serious as it was, but then often it goes to a calm or honeymoon phase, and there's a lull. Now, what happens over time is the frequency for that cycle of abuse increases, and the severity of the incidents also increases if there's no intervention. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the power and control wheel that was developed in Duluth, Minnesota, decades ago, actually, based on what they noticed about hundreds of women who were seeking their services, which is that there is a definite pattern. You have physical and sexual violence on the outside. In the middle is the power and control that all of this is based on. And in the different spokes of the wheel there, you see the different ways in which an abusive partner will use all of these elements in different combinations to establish and maintain control. One thing I do want to say about this is sometimes people will look at this and say, but I don't think my abuser or abusers actually don't feel powerful or in control, or they wouldn't use this. And that's absolutely true. It's actually all of this dynamic actually comes from a person's, the abuser's lack of self-esteem, their fear of losing the partner. So it's not like they're coming from a position of strength. They're trying to use these tools to establish control. Because of that, they don't feel that they are strong. I just want to say quickly something about the gendered nature of intimate partner violence. I'm going to be going through some stats quickly here, and I just wanted to acknowledge that we only have stats for male and female. That is how they've historically been collected, and still there's not great information about the gender diverse. But do know that we acknowledge that. We know that gender diverse individuals experience violence, and in some cases experience higher rates of violence. I also want to acknowledge that males experience intimate partner violence as victims as well, and they need help and support as well. And that regardless of gender, there will be different experiences of violence. So we often talk about intimate partner violence being a gendered crime or a gendered activity. And that's because when women are the victims, they are more likely to be physically injured. They're more likely to experience disruptions to their daily life. They're more likely to fear for their life. They receive more, there are repeated incidents of abuse. They are more likely to be victims of homicide. And when you look at the stat on the bottom there, 761 women and girls were killed by violence in Canada in the past 5 years. And the vast majority are killed by men who are close to them. So it's intimate partners, sometimes fathers, sometimes sons. But that stat is one thing that has been consistent over years. Now, sadly, in Saskatchewan, we consistently have over double the national rate per capita of police-reported incidents of intimate partner violence. And again, here in Saskatchewan, 80% of the victims are female, but guess what? Men reporting violence, intimate partner violence to the police is also more than double the national average. So we know we have a problem here. Sadly, about every 4 months, a woman in Saskatchewan is killed by a current or former partner. This is just a visual of what I just told you about the rates of violence across Canada. Those are numbers per 100,000, so it's a per capita rate. The territories have far higher rates, and they actually don't fit on this chart. It wouldn't fit on my screen. So, I mean, it's a complex question as to why Saskatchewan has such high rates. It's a complex issue, and there's complex answers to that, which I believe will be addressed in a couple of the upcoming slides. So one thing is there are women who face increased risk. First Nations, Inuit, Métis women, young women, women with disability. Significantly for Saskatchewan, women in rural and northern communities are ones, and this is true across Canada, actually, that women in rural and northern communities experience higher rates of violence. Saskatchewan has a lot of rural and remote areas. There's a lot of places where there isn't easy access to law enforcement to intervene, or easy access to shelters, domestic violence shelters, or other supports. So what we see in our rural and isolated communities, there's higher risk, there's fewer resources, there's geographic isolation. So sometimes that's physical difficulties. We have no bus service anymore to get from small communities to larger centers where there are services. Often there's concerns about confidentiality in seeking services in smaller communities, and all of this results in higher rates of domestic homicides in those areas. One of the most common questions that people who aren't very familiar with intimate partner violence will ask is, why doesn't she leave? And there are a number of reasons, and I'm not going to read everything on the list there, but what I want you to know is that someone who's experiencing this form of violence is always thinking about it, thinking about, do I have the funds? Is it safe? Where would I go? Will anyone believe me? What would the police say if I were, to ask them? So please be understanding that it's not an easy decision to make. And sometimes the most important reason is their own safety or the safety of children or pets if they do leave. Oftentimes, one of the things that's asked, if a victim puts up with violence for a long time, and then they do leave and go report to police, or other family members or acquaintances might say, well, if she was experiencing violence, why is there no record? Why didn't she ever go to the police? Because often they've been threatened. If you call the police, things will get worse. Fear of having the children taken away, if social services gets involved. And again, this is different in different communities. There are some populations, Indigenous communities especially, where they're simply more likely to have their children taken into care, or I think that's true, but there's also a greater fear, and so a distrust of the system. They may be very unlikely to call for help unless they feel that they need to do it. It's a life and death matter. In some, there might be pressure from the family to stay together. Again, sometimes it has to do with your faith. Sometimes there's a normalization of violence because you grew up in a home where violence was taking place. Sometimes it's a lack of culturally appropriate services. So for newcomers, if they can't receive services in their own language or language of comfort, that's a barrier for them. Children also are impacted by exposure to violence. And it is estimated that 360,000 children each year are witnessing or directly experiencing violence in their home. There's research to show that children who've been exposed to violence have not just immediate impacts, but lifelong physical and psychological impacts. So while it might not be too surprising to find out that children who are experiencing or being exposed, they don't even have to physically see it. They just need to be in a home where it's taking place there are changes in the home. There's stress, there's tension. Both parents are likely distracted. So things that happen are a long-term depression, anxiety, low self-esteem, but also physical impacts have been connected to childhood exposure to parental violence, including higher rates of diabetes, obesity, heart disease, and cancer. Children who are exposed to intimate partner violence have a higher likelihood of experience neglect and abuse. And I've quoted one study there that showed up to 60 to 75% of children in a home where intimate partner violence is taking place are actually experiencing either neglect or direct abuse themselves. And there's some evidence to show that children who grow up in a home where this sort of violence is normal, it's taking place, will tend to think that that's how relationships are. Violence happens in all relationships. And unfortunately, some of them will be, boys are more likely to be learning to act violently and get their way that way. Girls are more likely to learn that accepting abuse is normal and okay. Now, that's not a hard and fast rule. Not everybody will replicate what they've grown up with, but the risk is there, and it's been shown by research. So when we look at the fact that when children are in a home where domestic violence is taking place, and we can see that all forms of domestic violence are linked, and Josh alluded to this in the introduction. Elder abuse overlaps with domestic abuse, child maltreatment overlaps with domestic violence, and animal abuse overlaps with domestic violence. And for that reason, we at PATHS have been working in partnership with the Saskatchewan SPCA and Stops to Violence, working towards some common goals. We're all provincial organizations. We have common goals with slightly different mandates. Stops to Violence is ending violence more broadly, and that is their work. Saskatchewan SPCA obviously is most concerned with prevention of cruelty to animals. PATHS, we focus very much on intimate partner and family violence, but we've come together to address the link. And the link is the best way that I've heard it described is by Phil Arkow, which simply says, when animals are abused, people may be at risk, and when people are abused, animals may be at risk. So why is this so important? Well, for one thing, pets are part of our families. There's a huge portion of our population are pet owners. Around 40% between cats and dogs. Over 80% of people view pets as members of their family. And when you think about the person who's a victim, again, and making all these calculations for leaving a situation, an abusive situation, what's going to happen to their pets is part of that equation. Josh.
Hi, Joanne. I just wanted to. We got a comment here in the comment section that some folks might be having issues with sound. I just want to confirm that everybody is okay hearing. If you can just jump into the chat and let us know. Okay, we're seeing that it says all good now. But if you have any problems with sound, please just pop into the chat and let us know. Thank you.
I'm so happy that you did that. Sometimes if I'm charging my computer at the same time as I'm talking, my fan goes and it starts to make a whirring noise. So thanks to those who actually mentioned that. Hopefully you can all hear me better now. So again, our pets are very important to us. I know that there's my dog Maisie there looking proud with her entire collection of toys that she brought out to the living room. I personally would find it very difficult to make any move that meant I couldn't take my dog with me. And currently, it's very difficult to find domestic violence shelters that accept pets. There are some really good programs that Saskatchewan SPCA has been part of establishing where pets can be fostered for the duration that victims and survivors are in shelter. But there's nothing quite like being able to have your pet with you. We know that the animal-human bond is very strong. There is evidence to show that there are physical and psychological benefits to spending time with your dog. Not only do you get all the love and cuddles, you have to take your dog out for a walk. There's things you need to do with your cat. Getting out with either my neighbor used to walk her cat on a leash, so I know this is a thing. When you're out walking your pet, people are more likely to smile, to chat, to ask, the pet's name. So it actually helps to counteract isolation. So having a pet is very beneficial. Tragically, also, individuals who are using violence and abuse and intimidation within relationships may use the pets as a way to intimidate and control. Not only is it a consideration about if I leave, what do I do with my beautiful Maisie and the Clover, but what if I'm in the relationship and if I don't do what my partner says, he's not going to allow me to take Maisie to the vet, or he's not going to give me money to buy her food. Sadly, we have heard of numerous situations where the abusive partner drove out to, the country with the dogs and let them out. Other situations where the dog is injured. Other situations where the dogs are taken out and shot or otherwise harmed or killed. Because of the connection we have with our pets, it's a very powerful tool to use for manipulation and control. If you're interested in more information on the research on the link, there's two different, in fact, if I can be savvy enough to do this, can I, or am I going to mess everything up? I think I might just mess things up. I should not have done that. Oh dear. I'm trying to go back to my PowerPoint. I tried to click on the link and that was the wrong thing to do. Do know that, going back here, that you could go to Saskatchewan SPCA website for the violencelink.ca, or go there for research, and also pathssk.org for research. There's a number of different research reports and that can help show you how significant a barrier it can be for people who have pets who are wanting to leave violent situations. So what to say? First of all, be watchful. If you think that somebody is experiencing some of the elements, some of the risk factors, the different ways of abusing someone that we've been talking about, just notice it, just see it, recognize it, and pay attention. Then name it. So don't jump to conclusions, but you can speak to the person and say, you know what? I saw this or I heard this and I'm concerned. Are you okay? Check it. So this little thing that's easy to remember, see it, name it, check it, was developed by the Make It Our Business program. And it is an easy way to remember how to have a conversation. So some examples are here on the screen. And basically, it doesn't matter, your exact words or what the risk factor you've noticed is. The point is that you are naming what it was that you're concerned about, checking in, are you okay? And letting them know you're here for that person. I'm here if you want to talk. Are you okay? Very important. What not to say. Do not trash talk the partner. Many times, the statistic that I've heard for 26 years since I started this work is that it will take a victim 7 times to successfully leave. So people leave, they go back. There's lots of reasons that are very real and important to them that people will go back. So if you, as a person who's trying to support someone experiencing violence, takes the first opportunity to say things like, wow, it's about time, he's a terrible person, I don't know why you put up with it for so long, then they're not going to feel comfortable coming back to you the next time. Don't tell them what they should do. You should go to a lawyer. You should go to the police. No, let them make their choices and support those choices. Don't say, oh, that's so hard to believe. He's such a nice guy. That is also not helpful and means that the victim may be less likely to come to you in the future. Please do not say anything to anyone else if someone has come to you and told you about some abuse they're experiencing. One of the most serious risk factors is actually when a perpetrator, of course, of controlling violence, the serious form where they don't want their partner to leave them, that's their main thing. If I go to my next door neighbor and say, hey, I was chatting with Sally yesterday and she said things aren't going well and she might be leaving you. Did you know that? She's thinking about leaving you. Now, Sally, her risk for serious harm, injury, or death has just gone way up. Also, it's gossiping, it's not nice, don't do it, but also it's a very serious safety concern. Do remember, it's not your role to fix the situation. Reaching out, showing concern, and offering support can make such a big difference for someone, particularly someone who's feeling isolated and alone, who's feeling shame or stigma about reaching out. Choose a time and place to have the conversation where you have some privacy. You have some time afterwards if that person chooses to open up to you, that you don't have to rush off or they don't have to rush off and do something important right after. And always keep yourself safe. Don't get in the middle of an assault, and do call police in an emergency. Yes, Josh.
Yes, so we have a question that has come up, and I think this relates to on one of the what not to do slides, and not speaking to anybody else, but the question here is, what about to the police? Is it okay to speak to the police if you suspect somebody's being abused?
There's 2 times where I would say that is a thing you could do. One is if it's an emergency, you're hearing blood-curdling screams from the house next door and you feel that person is in immediate danger, please do call 911. The other time might be if it's someone you know fairly well and they're not responding to you. You feel that they're being isolated in the home. They're not responding to calls, texts, you knock on the door, nobody comes, that kind of thing. That might be a situation for a warrant of entry order, basically a welfare check to make sure that person is okay. Now, again, oftentimes victims and survivors have reasons for not wanting to call the police. I wouldn't, other than those 2 examples, or if you know or suspect that children are being directly harmed, then you have a duty to report to police. But be mindful that you want to be supportive to the victim. You want to support their choices. They've already been, told what to do. A lot of the control of their life has been taken away from them. So if you just think there might be violence occurring and you don't talk to the victim but call police, you might be making it worse for them. They may get reprisals. They may get increased violence. There's things that might not know about that could happen to that person. So if at all possible, find a time to check with them. In the other examples, then yes, I think it's good to call police.
Thank you.
So again, just, you're seeing hearing the theme here of things that are helpful, which is I care about you, I believe you, very important. It's not your fault. So often victims have been made to believe, well, if I hadn't done that, he wouldn't have hit me. None of this would be happening if I was a better cook, if I was a better mom, if I did this or that differently. And that's not the case. So it's really important for survivors to hear these things. And again, I will support you in your decisions is a very valuable thing to say to someone who's experiencing violence. So what to do? First of all, understand that leaving is a process. I already said that about victims often leave and return several times. It's not easy. There's many reasons why people choose to return, and victims shouldn't be faulted for trying to make their relationship work. Just let them know that you can be there. Many will choose not to report to the police. In fact, stats usually say about 1 in 5 incidents are reported to the police. I suspect there may be even more incidents that aren't reported. And again, you just want to support them in their choices and give them the information they need to stay safe. So risk factors is important for you to know, and it's something that you can also share with someone who might be experiencing violence. So this list of risk factors was developed mainly by Domestic Violence Death Review. So looking at what factors were present in situations when domestic violence went to the far end of the spectrum and there were deaths. So again, that actual or pending separation and a history of domestic violence are the 2 most common risk factors when domestic homicide takes place. So sharing information about someone who's thinking about leaving is really not a good idea. If there is obsessive behavior on the part of the perpetrator, this is, again, stalking is also in here, but anything where it's obsessive, what are you doing? Who are you talking to? What are you wearing? Following the person around, that is a red flag. If the perpetrator is depressed, whether clinically or just as observed by friends, family, that's a risk factor. If there have been prior threats or attempts of suicide, it means that the person may feel they have nothing left to lose. And as, again, tragically, many domestic homicides are actually homicide-suicide, so very concerning. If the level of violence has been increasing recently, that is a risk factor. When the victim has an intuitive sense of fear, so they are concerned that they're in danger, this is significant. Take it seriously. If there have been threats to kill, when the perpetrator is unemployed or there are financial difficulties, that's also been linked to lethality. And, we can speculate on how that all feeds into this dynamic of gendered violence and if it's a male perpetrator, did they feel that they needed to be able to support their family, which is now further attacking their own self-esteem. These are societal issues that we need to work out in terms of rigid gender roles, but that has been linked through domestic violence death reviews as a risk factor. Any prior attempts to isolate the victim from friends and family. So all of these risk factors are dangerous. When they're in combination and the more risk factors that are present, the more dangerous the situation is. So do know the resources in your area. There's domestic violence shelters, there are services. I'm going to show you in an upcoming slide what, how you can get in contact with those. But if you were going to, reach out to someone and say, hey, I noticed that you've been very upset lately. I'm really concerned about you. Are you okay? If you're thinking that it is intimate partner violence, just check out some resources in your community first. So you can say, I checked it out and they do walk-ins, or I checked it out and you can phone for an appointment. It's no cost, so that you're able to provide that information when speaking to someone who's might be experiencing violence. You can let them know what a shelter is like. Sometimes people don't understand. It's actually free. You can self-refer. You get your own bedroom. There's staff present 24/7 who are helping navigate the system. There's optional group support as well as crisis counseling on site. And in a domestic violence shelter, women's choices are always supported. Josh.
Yes, we have another question, and this question is: has the use of Clare's Law come up more now?
Yeah, actually, interestingly enough, I believe it's tomorrow we're reviewing, I believe it's 4 applications. So it had kind of a slow start. I think the fact that we're in a pandemic might have impacted people aren't getting out, they're not circulating, there's no parties. By and large, people aren't going to the bar. They're not necessarily getting into new relationships at the same rate. But certainly, it'll be a year in June since Saskatchewan has had Clare's Law available, and there's a gradual increase in the cases that the applications that are being made under Clare's Law. I actually do sit on the review committee that looks at the applications, and I can tell you that the vast majority of them are very, very serious high risk situations where the person who's the questions being asked about has a lengthy and distressing, to me, scary level of violent behavior, sometimes including violence or harm towards children. And then you think about that new partner who's getting involved with this person, potentially not knowing that background. So with every case we review, I become more and more convinced that this is saving lives. So yeah, thanks for that question. It is, and I think I'm a big supporter of Clare's Law.
Thank you.
And just going to quickly glance at some of this legislation. Clare's Law is one of them. Just know that there's legislation out there. I don't expect, depending on the work you do, you to necessarily know, the letter of the law in all of these. Your domestic violence shelters and services will know all of these things. So an emergency intervention order briefly allows the victim and children to remain in the home while the perpetrator is asked to leave. The warrant of entry relates to the question of, can police check up on someone? A victim's assistance order can help with financial costs related to abuse if there have been police charges and convictions. Clare's Law, we spoke about briefly. It's the ability to share information about someone. If you're just getting involved or someone you care about is just getting involved in a relationship, there's red flags. Consider applying under Clare's Law. Risk level will be disclosed, support will be provided, and in some cases there may be further information provided to help that person stay safe. The Residential Tenancies Act has been amended so that people can break a lease in 28 days. So that if someone is living with an abusive partner, they can actually they're not stuck there for a year, they can get out. And there is now workplace leave if you're a victim or survivor of intimate partner violence. You need to take some time off to move, to go to counseling, to go to court, to get medical appointments. You can now do that, and 5 days paid, 5 days unpaid under our current legislation. You can support efforts to establish pet-friendly shelters. Again, we've been working with Saskatchewan SPCA and Stops to Violence on this. We have an online 50-50 draw, usually in the fall every year. And just check in with your local shelter. If you're supporting someone who has pets, check in and find out, is there any way that they can help find a place for the pets? There's a few examples of places that that allow pets in their shelters. And a pioneer in the area is Allie Phillips, and I just put that down there. She started the Safety Shelters program, sheltering animals and families together, and it's been very successful in the US. So where can you find help? This is very important. In the front of every Direct West phone book in Saskatchewan, you'll find the abuse helplines pages, which have resources in your area. You can go to PATH's website. You can go to sheltersafe.ca. That's the map you have here. It's a clickable map, and it has all of Canada. And you can also go to abuse. There's an abuse page on Saskatchewan 211. Certainly, you can call your local shelter and service, and even just talk to them if you're wanting to support someone else, and ask them how you can best support them. And that is the end. There's my contact information, and we have a little bit of time for other questions. And so at this point, if people want to take off their mic and ask verbally, I'm happy to answer questions verbally or through the chat if there are any.
Actually, Joanne, one request that we had was somebody had missed the first few minutes of the presentation, and they missed the cycle of abuse slide, and they're wondering if we could revisit that.
Okay. I'm going to take the very low-tech way out here and just go all the way back to that. So again, this was developed with, the benefit of individuals who've worked with many victims and saw this happening repeatedly. If for those people on the webinar here who do work in shelters, they're going to have heard this story, heard this cycle repeated many times by the survivors that they work with. Anyone who's experienced intimate partner violence is going to know that it happens over and over again, that everything's fine and everything's good, and then suddenly the victim will begin to tell when tensions are building, something's about to happen. Sometimes the victim will even provoke the incident just to get it past that part of the cycle over to reconciliation and back to calm or honeymoon phase.
Thank you. There is still a couple of minutes. If you do have any questions, again, we encourage you to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Again, just have your mouse down there below. You'll see the Q&A button. Click on that. It'll pop up the window and you can ask your question. Joanne, in the couple of minutes that we have left here, well, maybe we wait for some questions. Is there anything happening at wrong organization, at Paths rather, that you want to mention and make the folks aware of?
Sure. Yeah, I've mentioned a couple things that we've done, but a couple things in addition that I could mention is that Paths has been running a series of public service announcements on Rawlco radio stations across the province. You might not know it's us because they direct the listeners to the abusehelplines.org. That's actually an alternate address for Paths. And our hope there was actually to begin, again, if we think back to that map where Saskatchewan was the big red line at the bottom of the screen, one of the things we haven't done in Saskatchewan is have a really broad-based public awareness campaign to let people know that violence is not okay, to let them know what it looks like, that there's help out there, that they will be believed, and encouraging them to reach out for help and support. Another thing that's really, really important is for anyone who's actually thinking, sometimes what we know is that there's not a lot of support out there for individuals who are using violence in relationships. And maybe they don't want to do that, but they just don't know any other way to be. They don't have good communication skills. They don't have good relationship skills. But we don't really put it out there that those individuals are also in need of help and support. So if anybody, you shouldn't just reach out to support someone who's experiencing violence, but it's important to reach out to those who are using violence. And you can do it in the same way. See it, name it, check it. I saw you yelling at your wife across the fence when I was in the backyard last Friday. I'm concerned. Is there anything I can do to help you? I actually know the name of a really good counselor if you're interested, and just open that door for support, even for those who are using violence.
That's a really good point. I'm not sure personally if I would have thought to approach somebody who might be using violence, but definitely a good step to utilize. We do have a question as well here, and I know we're getting close to 1 o'clock, so if you have to leave, we understand. We will make the recording available later in a couple days down the road here. So be aware that you will still get access to everything that takes place after you leave. And Joanne, if you have to depart as well, we can certainly look to draw this to a close. But the one question that we have is, can you share a little bit more about Clare's Law?
It's one of my favorite topics, so sure, I can. So Clare's Law is named after Claire Wood from the UK, a young woman who lost her life after being in a relationship with someone she met online. Her father was very concerned, didn't like the guy, kept asking her to leave to take measures to keep herself safe. And she did break it off, but he kept pursuing her. He was harassing her. Claire actually went to police in the UK several times. They never told her that this individual had a history. He'd spent 6 years actually in jail for a violent sexual assault and confinement conviction. And Claire didn't know that. And so Claire's dad fully believes that had Claire known that, she would have taken more steps to keep herself safe. She would have, moved, like relocated, gone to live with her dad, whatever, and she would not have died. So he advocated for this to it's not legislation in the UK, it's actually a policy, but it allows for two things. Not only can for individuals who are either concerned about someone they're getting involved in, or if, for example, my daughter was getting involved in a relationship that I thought wasn't safe, I could potentially make a Clara's Law application on her behalf. I wouldn't get the risk information, she would, if she was willing to hear it, if there was something found. But I could actually apply on behalf of someone that I have a close personal relationship with. If I had been married to someone who was extremely abusive, there was a criminal record, and now I see that they're dating, my kid's friend's mom, I can make an application under Clara's Law on behalf of that new partner of my ex, because I'm afraid that person's at risk. And actually, a number of the Clara's Law applications the committee has reviewed were exactly that. It was a third person. And it also allows the police, maybe showing up at a domestic conflict, as they call it, they interrupt things. They notice one partner has a lengthy history of domestic violence, but this is a new partner who doesn't know. So there's the right to ask and there's the right to know. So police could proactively tell this new partner they should apply under Clara's Law. The committee reviews it. We don't share like all of the information that the committee has access to, but there are domestic violence professionals as well as victim services and law enforcement on the committee, and there will be information and supports offered when it's appropriate.
Sticking with Claire's Law, so if somebody wanted to file an application, would they just approach their local police service? And then you had also mentioned that there's a review process. So how long does it take from, I guess, starting the process and submitting the application until you finally receive the information?
I believe the protocol says like a maximum of 30 days between the initial application and the final disclosure, if there's something to disclose. Some of them have been gone through quicker, more quickly. And yes, you definitely can go directly to any police service. So it used to be it was just municipal. RCMP are now participating, so you could go to any one of those. You could also, if you were nervous about that, you could actually go to a domestic violence shelter or counseling service, like call them, let them know this is what you want. They can support you through the process. A lot of people may not be comfortable walking into the police station, again, particularly in smaller communities. You might not want to do that. So if that's the case, you can start the process over the phone, through one of our member agencies, and then just let the police know that you would like to meet away from the police station, and they should accommodate that. There are a number of steps. There's an initial application review by the police service. Then it goes to the committee. The committee makes a recommendation. All the information technically belongs to the police. The committee doesn't see people's names. It's all very confidential. But then the police are the ones who just deliver the disclosure later on.
And is there a fee associated with this at all?
No fee for this service. And again, I did say that shelter services, you could stay for up to 6 weeks. There's no charge for that. Many of the counseling services also don't charge for domestic violence counseling. So I think that's something that people often are worried about, so it's hopefully that helps to know that there's no charge for any of those things.
Great. Thank you so much, Joanne. This has been a very insightful presentation. And I see that there's a comment that's been made where somebody has made a realization that maybe they know somebody who's in need of some supports, and they will reach out to this person in their life. So, it's that is a clear example of how important this information is, and how, just attending a webinar could be life-changing for some folks, I think. We do have a couple of things that we would like to mention just before we say farewell today. As I had mentioned, the webinar is being recorded, and we will share the recordings in the near future here through YouTube. We'll make them available. We encourage you, if you are interested in learning more about future webinars that are coming up, you can subscribe to our mailing list by visiting our website. The URL is saskspca.ca/webinar-signup. Maybe you are, my colleague Crystal just popped it in the chat there, so you'll have that link. We have one remaining webinar in the Violence Link webinar series, and that is the topic there is animal abuse. There are a couple of spots available. If you are interested in signing up for that, you can visit our website again at saskspca.ca/events. And we do have a future webinar coming up on June 8th with Joanne's colleague from PAVS. Crystal Giesbrecht will be discussing intimate partner violence and animal ownership and the experiences of survivors and service providers. It will also be a Zoom webinar again on June 8th. There is a $10 registration fee for that webinar, but you can learn more and register at violencelink.ca/WTEV. And again, Joanne had mentioned a resource available too, violencelink.ca, which is a website that we've created at the SaskSPCA that talks a bit about the link between animal abuse and interpersonal violence. And there's a variety of resources available that you can find on that website. Joanne, do you have any closing remarks before we say farewell today?
Just to thank everybody for attending, for giving up your lunch hour. I'm really touched by the comment that there's somebody who may be helped, or one of you here today will be reaching out to someone who may be experiencing abuse. That's why we do this work, and I just again thank you so much, and I hope that this helps you support others in our community.
Thank you again so much, Joanne, and thank you to everybody who joined us today. If you will be attending the animal abuse webinar on Thursday, we will see you then. And again, if not, thank you for joining us today.